We have a packed house today and so much happening in the world right now that we're dealing with information coming in really quickly to us. And I know that you guys have a lot of questions and are dealing with things of your own. So I'm happy to have Jason Russell here with me. I'll introduce Jason in just a minute. And Jason and I want to be part of your toolbox of resources that helps you over the next days and weeks. And so we have a lot of content. I'm going to jump right into it and get going here. So, and also I'm pretty fanatical about timeliness. I like to start on time. I like to end on time, but Jason and I are committed to hanging out a little bit longer if we need to, because we have a lot of questions from you guys and we want to be mindful of that and try to get you supported best way we can. So here's what we want to talk about today. A couple of quick news bits from things happening at Hinge. We want to talk to you guys about the basic things you should be doing. Some of this is common sense, but bear with us because we're going to talk a lot about parent and staff communications, and we want you to remind your parents of the things that you have always done and continue to do more diligently. We're going to talk to you about some of the precautions that some of our clients are taking that go beyond that and why they're doing that. We want to talk a little bit about the economic impacts that we see coming up and what's being done about that. And then we want to talk about future master classes. And we're actually going to do another one on Monday, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. A couple of things, and some of these are already out of date within the last hour. We're in our Essentialism Masterclass theme, and we're going to pause that for just a bit for the next month or two. And we're going to do pop-up master classes as new information becomes available on strategies and things that are going on around the virus. We appreciated everyone that was with us in Miami at Shift, and these are some of our fun photos from that. We announced our shift for next year, which will be in California in Newport Beach, and hope you guys can make it there. More on that later. We have our next Thrive workshop, which is our 1.5-day financial deep dive in Portland, Oregon, coming up in September. Registration will open next week, so hope to see you guys there. Let us know if you have more questions around that. I was about to tell you guys that Kathy and Alec from our team would be in Atlanta next week for the Georgia Child Care Association, but that just got postponed within the last hour. I think we're going to continue to see national conferences postponing. We've got a good many coming up for the next couple of months, so probably meetings and big gatherings we will see hit a pause button in a lot of areas. So before we jump into the COVID-19 information, and I introduced Jason to give you some information, just in the last hour, I spoke with Chris Smith from Child Care Network. And Chris and his team have been dealing over the last couple of days in real time what we believe to be the first issue in a school closing. And so they are making this process up as they go. And they have been so very gracious in allowing me to share what they've done for the past 3 days, which is amazing, what they're doing today. And then also Chris Smith, David Evans, and Jamie, see if I can pronounce that name right, Reckheimer. I'm sorry, Jamie. Jamie's leading their response team. The three of them are going to join me on a masterclass on Monday at 1 o'clock to talk to you guys about their experience this week. Here's what is going on with them. Last week, they had a teacher, a 3-year-old teacher at one of their Atlanta area schools, hospitalized. The teacher does have underlying health issues, and she was hospitalized and over the weekend tested positive for the virus. They made the decision on Monday to close the center for 2 days to do a deep clean. So this was a voluntary decision. They were not required to do it, but they made the decision to do that. They called parents on Monday, asked them to pick up the children. They shut down Tuesday and Wednesday and did a deep clean. Chris shared with me that they called 3 cleaning crews and were only able to secure 1 bid. So they used that crew, and maybe it was that they were too busy. Maybe it was that they chose not to do that job. I asked him for the cost of that. He said somewhere around $2,500. So not terrible, not insignificant. They contacted licensing just because they chose to. And according to Chris, licensing was a little out of their element. They have not really dealt with this broadly yet. And based on the experience at their company, they intend to go to the licensing entities in all 4 states that they heavily operate in and help them figure out how to help others as they go through the process. Who they really dealt with was the Department of Public Health. Chris said that they were not really prepared for the amount of information the Department of Public Health required. And this is one thing he would recommend. They required all the staff's names, contact information, and they interviewed each one of those people. Based on that interview and those teams' proximity to the teacher that tested positive, they identified 5 teachers that were not allowed to go back to work, that needed a quarantine. And also they shut down the 3-year-old class only, which is where the teacher was. So because Child Care Network has other schools in the area, they're working to bring teachers in from other schools or to disperse children to other schools. I know that's a difficult situation from you guys with a single school or schools that aren't close enough to do that, but that's the strategy they're trying to take. Because of that, they have identified a task force. It sounds like the head of that task force will be with us on Monday. They're having 7:30 a.m. daily task force meetings. They call stand-up meetings, meaning we don't want to sit down and make this last forever. We want to stand up, hit the issues, and move on. And every day they deal with what's going on company-wide and what the questions are so they can answer questions. Some of the questions have been things that I never considered, and I'm sure they didn't either. Should we allow new parents to tour? Should we allow new parents to enroll? And what questions are we allowed to ask? They haven't made the decision internally about what questions to ask, but according to Chris, since this has been declared now a pandemic, some of the questions you couldn't ask legally, you can ask now. So hopefully we get more guidance from Chris on Monday about what they're able to ask. They're thinking about, what if the public schools shut down? Do we then also shut down? If we don't shut down, what do we do with a large number of after schoolers that may come our way? They have things like, there's a teacher on a cruise, she's due back Monday, should we allow her back? So you see the level of questions that people are going to start to deal with that will come up. And Chris and the team at Child Care Network has offered to share their experience. It's been a difficult week for them, and they know that they're dealing with things that others are going to deal with. And we so appreciate their willingness to step forward and share with us. The other thing that Chris mentioned is that he is part of a larger national group called ECEC. We had these guys speak at our recent SHIFT conference, and they are providing information about what they expect the economic impact to be on their schools. And this information is being shared with Congress so they can make some decisions about possible relief for people who are affected. So that was a lot of information that just came in the last hour. After Jason shares his information on what to do internally, we'll talk a little bit more about that. What does this look like from a business standpoint? What do you need to be prepared for? So lots of words, Jason. I'm talking fast because we've got a lot to talk about, and thank you so much for joining. And would you share with our guests here your work and background and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kathy, and thanks everybody for jumping on today. Obviously a pretty hot topic and one that's not going to go away anytime soon. So um, my business is basically a security consulting firm. We work mainly with child cares, uh, a group of former Secret Service agents. The majority of what we do is in the emergency preparedness area. So dealing with emergency plans, vulnerability assessments on facilities, training of staff on how to respond to a variety of incidents. We also work a lot on crisis and dealing with unique situations such as what we're dealing with right now, which is, has the potential to be pretty disruptive to people's businesses. So we've been in business since 2012. Um, my wife, I started the business because my wife is actually owns 5 locations here in Michigan, and actually my office is co-located right in the childcare. So I'm very familiar with obviously the childcare industry and the business and all the challenges. And we've been dealing with pretty much nonstop phone calls since probably in the last couple of weeks here, just on this issue and how different clients can deal with it. So happy to give some information. So one of the things I think it's really important to understand as it relates to kind of how to start. Some of you may have already put communication out to your families or put a letter together. Uh, I think that has to be the starting point. And I really think there's 2 different areas you have to consider, both internal communication with your staff to make sure that everybody is on the same page in terms of the steps that are being taken, the strategies that are being deployed, and then external communication, which is to your parents, your families, maybe even your vendors and other stakeholders that you might have. Uh, I would generally tell you to prioritize internal communication first, or at least communicate internally at the same time you communicate externally. Because if you don't, what you'll have happen, and we had it with a client earlier today, where a parent came in who made mention that he was feeling sick, and the staff member took it upon themselves to make the leap that this parent, had coronavirus. And once that gets out there, it's pretty hard to put the genie back in the bottle. So you're going to want to come up with a very specific plan, strategy for, obviously, on the preventative side. What are we going to do to prevent this from happening in the first place? What steps are we taking on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, to prevent, the impact that we could possibly have with this virus coming into our school? What are we going to do if we do have an incident, if we do have somebody who's infected? And then a lot of what Kathy's going to talk about is what's the long-term business impact of this. So, you know, one of the things I think you have to really consider is the parents that you're dealing with are getting communication from a lot of different sources. So almost every entity that does business right now is putting out communication on what their plan is related to this incident. I got an email today from my rental car company related to how they're responding to the coronavirus. I got an email from a hotel that I stayed in one time 5 years ago. So they're being inundated with, this is our plan and how we're going to deal with this. I think the unique thing about what's going to come from you is it's obviously dealing with their children. And it's going to take on a whole different level and a whole different weight than, Avis rental car who tells me they're going to wipe the steering wheel down, which I assume they did anyways, but maybe that's not the case. So I think you have to really be very specific and key in on your communication and make sure that you're detailing what your plan is. Obviously, a lot of you should really be attaching your strategies to the CDC strategy, which is the best information that's out there. There's nobody that's going to create a magic bullet for this that's going to be that's going to be unique from what the CDC guidance is. So if you attach a lot of your communication and your information to the CDC guidelines, you can't go wrong, because that's really what we're following, as a country, uh, are those specific guidelines. And there's tons of resources. If you haven't, been to the CDC website, there's posters, there's things you can put up. There's information you can disseminate. We have a membership site, so for our members, we've been regularly posting information on our membership site for our members to be able to pass on to their families. So you're going to want to communicate, and a lot of what you're going to see today, and you've probably seen it if you watch the news or listening to anybody talk. A lot of it is very basic information. I mean, it's not rocket surgery, as they say, and a lot of it's just attached to the kind of the basic hygiene that you'd want to practice. So, but you want to communicate what you're doing with parents, especially in terms of cleaning and disinfecting. And if if you don't already have a regular schedule for that, like we're doing it twice a day or we're doing it in the evening, obviously we're washing the kids' hands and we're disinfecting as necessary. You want to detail that for them. It should be obvious, but you need to make it more than obvious. So put it as part of what you're doing, and put the schedule. It's important for people to know this is how often we're doing this. This is why. Obviously, we're doing it as needed. Um, One of the things that's popped up recently is, hand sanitizer is like gold now. Their prices have gone up, but you can very easily create hand sanitizer. I just Googled it this morning, just looking, and there's about 1,000 different recipes for hand sanitizer. Interestingly enough, a lot of them included vodka, which I thought was interesting, maybe for your teachers after that. Probably don't want to use the vodka recipe, but there's a lot of them that include isopropyl alcohol, and you can mix it up. And actually, what I think you could do in that situation is even make it something that the kids are able to do as part of communicating this to the kids. Because one of the things that I think, especially as the kids get older, is they're hearing this on TV. My youngest son is in 3rd grade, but he's asking questions about this, and Jesus, this is going to hurt me. And I think eventually we're going to have to start communicating this down to the kids. So one of the ways you can do that is by, implementing things like hand washing songs. I talked to an owner yesterday who created a contest at her center. Every classroom created their own hand washing song, and then they were going to vote on which hand washing song was the best. They were creating their own hand sanitizer. One of the things that maybe you're not as aggressive on in the past that I think you really have to be aggressive on and enforce almost in a very rigid fashion is your sick policy, both for kids and for staff. Because the bad thing about this virus is many times you're most contagious before you actually even start showing symptoms, which makes it really difficult because you can't know that you have it until you start showing symptoms. But you're actually contagious, and sometimes 7 days before you actually start to exhibit symptoms. But you have to definitely be enforcing almost to an extreme degree your sick policy. So whether that's on the kids with fevers and making sure that you have the supplies necessary to be taking kids' temperatures and monitoring those situations, so that when you do find somebody who maybe has a temperature, that we're getting them out of the center as quickly as possible. And we're having a zero tolerance policy for that. And I know parents push back on that a lot because, it's been 18 hours, they haven't had a fever, but you really need to stick with that policy. And what you're going to see overall, and I've been getting a lot of calls from people saying, don't you think we're overreacting? Don't you think this is kind of an overreaction? And it's an extreme reaction, but it has to be extreme because if we don't go too far, if we try to just go far enough, then we could have a very serious situation on our hands. So I think what you're seeing with all the cancellations and maybe what some people deem to be kind of an overreaction is actually appropriate, because what we can do is kind of slow that curve down. And instead of having that extreme spike, we're going to see it, hopefully, with some of the measures that are being taken, it's going to be a much smaller spike. We have not reached the worst of this by any means, but I think some of the reactions that we're having, I think, are appropriate to slow that. Obviously, you want to isolate sick children immediately. You want to get them out of the center, out of the school as quickly as possible. Limit big group gatherings. Volunteers to the extent possible, keeping anybody who does not need to be in the school, try to keep them out of the school. I mean, sometimes our visitor policies, we have people wandering around that don't necessarily need to be there. To the extent we can keep people out of the schools in terms of just wandering around and being in areas where they don't need to be, we definitely need to do that, and try to limit just the contact that people are having. Obviously, avoid face touching. That's one that we see all the time. And if you actually just watch somebody, even me, I probably touched my face 3 times since I've been talking. It's really hard, obviously, to get kids to do it, but we want to have those conversations with our staff about avoiding touching faces, trying to avoid touching kids' faces too. And then all the other kind of personal, the sneezing into your arms, extra hand washing for parents. I really love the idea of that homemade spray bottle and a staff member actually standing at the front door, greeting parents in the morning and saying, "Hey, let me spray your hands," if you're coming in, and making sure that everybody's is doing what they need to do to stay clean. One of the things to recognize is the age group that you're servicing is by no means within the high risk category at all. In fact, there hasn't been a fatality in a child under 10 years of age anywhere in the world. And the vast majority of fatalities related to this are people above 60 with significant underlying medical conditions. And those are generally in 2 categories. They're respiratory, so people with COPD, smokers, things like that, or they're cardiopulmonary, so their heart issues. And those are the reasons that this virus is much harder on that age group. The fatality rate from kind of of your staff range, even, which is generally that 18 to 30 35 range, is about 0.2%. So it's extremely low. The overall fatality rate is somewhere in the 3% range, which is about 10 times higher than the normal flu, but it's still pretty low. And the demographic of the customers we serve and the demographic generally of our parents are definitely not within that high risk category, which I think is a good thing as we move forward to hopefully limit, the real negative impacts that we would have. You can go ahead and change the slide. You want to communicate as often as possible, especially if there is, once the rumors start, like what happened in one of our clients earlier, where just the word coronavirus was said because of a sick person, and that took on a life of its own. You want to make sure you're communicating daily, positives and negatives, and what you're doing, what steps are being taken, and that you're monitoring the situation. A big part of what parents are looking for is just to know that you're paying attention to this. It's not being put on the back burner. You're taking it seriously, and you have a plan. And that plan might include, what are we going to do if we have an outbreak here? What's the, and you need to think about that as an individual business. I know Kathy mentioned, what do we do if the school closes? Well, you're not necessarily tied to any other entity in your area. If your local health department recommends that you close, I would recommend you follow the lead of your local officials. But one of the things that I think is important to recognize is there's a few hot spots. So what you might do here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where we only have 2 cases in the entire state of Michigan, we're going to follow the CDC guidelines, which really aren't calling for any closures at this point. They're calling for limitations of groups and things like that, but not necessarily any closures. But if I had a school in New Rochelle, New York, where the National Guard is located now and helping out, I may have a different approach. So based on where you're located and kind of what's happening in your local area, you may want to adjust your approach based on the increase in threat that might be perceived in your area. Communicate regularly with your local health department. A lot of times we're scared to call. We know that they're inundated, and they are, but it doesn't hurt to reach out and ask questions. If you have a question about a specific topic, that they may have some guidance or some information that they can provide you. And in fact, they may actually have some external communication that you can provide. In fact, I was just, before we jumped on here, I was just watching the news story, and they came out with what I think is new information, which is to say that this virus, they're now saying, can live in the air, out in the open air, for up to 3 hours. So those pieces of information are going to continue to come in, and you probably don't have time to sit and watch the news. So it's either going to come from resources like us or from your local health department. So you're going to want to communicate regularly with them and make sure that you're staying abreast of what the latest is in your area, because there are some states that still don't have this. They have no they have no incidents. One of the things I think you're going to see in probably the next 2 weeks, because the testing is increased, is you're going to see a dramatic spike in numbers. We're actually already seeing that right now. People are attributing that to this high contagion rate, and really what I think is actually happening is we're finally testing people for it. So now we're getting positive tests that people are infected, when in fact they probably, they were infected all along. We just hadn't been testing. So you're going to see this dramatic spike, which I think is going to cause kind of an increased stress reaction from the public, because they're going to see this dramatic increase in numbers. And I think a little bit, to a certain extent, I think that increase is going to be a little bit artificial, and a lot of it's going to be based on just the increase in testing that we're finally doing. So go ahead. If you have the ability, watching for the fevers, watching for the increase in temperatures, swiping foreheads before kids are entering school, if you can limit parents from coming in as much as possible, once again, just trying to control your environment as much as you possibly can. Any travel to countries that are high risk, Italy, Europe right now, what they're seeing in Europe right now, that's coming for us next. It started in China. The interesting thing about China is they had the ability to do things that would not work here in the US. They were able to quarantine entire cities. You can't do that in the United States. People just aren't going to do it. So what you're seeing actually is their numbers they actually controlled it fairly well, and their numbers are going down. And now Europe is kind of the next, where it's moved next, and it's eventually coming, it's going to be increased to us. If you have the ability to pay sick employees to stay home, and have them do maybe some work at home, if that's possible. I know obviously from even my wife's standpoint, it's pretty tough, right? I mean, to be able to pay people to not be here. We like to pay them when they are here and they're doing the work that they need to do. The good news is I think you're going to see some help coming from the federal government on that front, to hopefully, limit the exposure that businesses are going to have, because you may have to make a tough decision at some point. I'm sure Kathy's going to cover this, of if we're closing, are we and we're going to try to pay employees, that money has to come from somewhere. And how is that going to happen? If you're closed, obviously, and the more cleaning you can do, the more disinfecting you can do, the better off you're going to be. And just making it a regular habit is going to be real crucial. Go ahead and go to the next one. And lastly, and I think actually when Kathy pointed out earlier about Child Care Network, one of the things that I mentioned to her yesterday when we were talking about this is tracking is a big deal when it comes to these types of situations. Who had contact with who and when is going to be a big issue once this starts to move and people start to get infected. So especially in the childcare setting, as you know, you have people moving from different rooms. You have a lot of moving pieces within a center in terms of staff, because of ratios and those types of things. And we often don't track that. And it is hard to track, but to the extent possible, either trying to limit that movement so that you can track it. If you do have a staff member, because here's where the big issue is going to pop up, and it's going to happen to one of you. So you're going to have a staff member that gets infected, and every parent is going to want to know if their child had any contact with that staff person. And if you cannot give them an answer, that's going to be a problem. So to the extent that you can track staff movement and who's in what room at what time, I know it's difficult, and it's not something that I would necessarily say you need to do forever, but it's going to be real crucial when you have a health department that's coming out and saying, okay, we need to start quarantining people. Who has been in contact with this employee? What kids were they in contact with? Because now we not only have the kids, we have the kids' families. I mean, that's the reason these situations get out of control, is because, and especially with something that's so contagious like this one, is one person can infect so many other people. And then it just becomes an order of magnitude, because once they infect one, it just doubles and doubles and doubles. So the ability to track those situations becomes extremely crucial, so that you can determine who's at risk and who isn't, because I don't want to quarantine myself or my family if there's no risk to me. Isolation is the best strategy. Obviously, And I think that's where a lot of the calls I'm getting are from centers who are saying, why are we canceling, the March Madness, and the NBA's canceled their games. We have to go ahead of this problem so that it doesn't get bad. And the reason is because the hospitals will be overrun. If we just let this kind of roll like the normal flu, you're going to have a situation where we're not going to have the medical community is going to get overrun because just the sheer numbers of people that are sick are going to be so high. So to the extent possible, we have to go a little bit extreme here on the front end. And I think by doing that, hopefully, we will limit the impacts of this in the long term and really be able to kind of control this so that it doesn't have long-term and lasting impacts. And the hope is, obviously, they're working on vaccines and they're working on therapeutics every day. And hopefully we can ride this storm out until, I believe they're looking at possibly vaccine as early as, early 2021, which is a long ways away. And there's a lot of storm to weather before that, which is why I think a lot of these steps are being taken that many people feel is a little bit extreme. And I mentioned before, obviously, that an infected person is contagious before they show symptoms. That makes it extremely difficult. It's a little bit unlike the normal flu where you're contagious when you're showing symptoms. You're actually contagious with this one before you actually start showing symptoms. So by the time you have it, you have to backtrack to see all the people that you've had contact with in the previous, in the previous days. Which is why the solid fundamentals are so key. That constant disinfecting, that really reinforcing it for the parents at home, and doing everything you possibly can to just kind of limit that spread.
Fantastic information. Thank you, Jason. To piggyback, I want to talk about the economic impact. To piggyback a little bit on some of the things that Jason said. First, I'd like to say that you guys who are plugged into me have heard me say so many times that the reason I stay working only in this industry is that the community is so impressive. And this week, I have been on the phone with the national groups, and almost all of them who were able to get to me readily shared what their strategies were, what they were doing. They're talking to each other. They gave me permission to use anything that they have. And I think we'll just continue to see the community come together. So the advanced strategies that you heard largely came from either Jason or some of the national groups. Some of these economic impacts came from them. My team is working on, to begin with, 3 resources that will be on our website and available to you guys within the next couple of days. We want to help you craft a generic parent letter that you can customize and use. We will post a sanitizer recipe or 2. Someone has sent us one in our questions, and I'll tell you that shortly. And also a link to the CDC's guidelines for childcare centers, I think, is a great place to direct your parents when they have questions and to let them know what you are doing there. So let's talk about what this is going to do to us economically. If you guys were with us in Miami, I did a breakout session on recession planning, and that was 2 weeks ago. And I never thought that I would be here 2 weeks later talking about something that has the potential to have a short-term, it will have a short-term economic impact. It could also have a longer-term economic impact. So I may actually do that webinar in the next couple of weeks so that you guys can start to think about what happens in the long run if this gets to be bigger than a couple of weeks. And also, like I said, we're going to commit ourselves to gathering ideas for you guys and holding regular webinars to share those. Let's talk about what might happen in the short run economically. So what I really like for you guys to do, and what I'm hearing from most of the other providers, is to plan for a 2-week shutdown economically. So some of the decisions, and you guys are not the only ones that are thinking about this, you may not be shut down at all. You may choose not to shut down. Um, you may have a situation like Child Care Network did, where they chose to shut down for 2 days. They didn't have to. Um, but what I would like for you guys to do to prepare, so in the recession planning, I talked about a liquidity issue if we have another recessionary event, which will last typically about 17 months. But I want you guys to think in terms of, at a minimum, what happens if my school needs to shut down for 2 weeks? And some of the big questions, again, the national groups are asking these same questions. And I don't think at this point there are any collective decisions. At this point, we kind of need to know what the questions are so we can be prepared. But if you're shut down for 2 weeks, do you continue to pay your staff? One of the things that you heard Jason talk about is, if you do have to shut down, what can your team members do at home? If you choose to pay them, can they do online training at home? Can they develop curriculum from home? Can they start planning for your summer program at home? If you're shut down, can they come in and do a deep clean with you in the school? Can they begin to plant a garden in preparation for the summer? Can they get their classrooms ready? What can you do to allow those team members to work and be productive if you choose to continue to pay them? Hopefully, we'll see some economic relief. It has been mentioned that we might see some relief in payroll taxes, and that's obviously intended to help you keep people's pay intact so we don't have a huge issue on individuals who depend on their paycheck. Um, it has also been mentioned that we could possibly see a delay in when tax payments are due to help with the liquidity event. So start to think about some of those things. The next thing that others are thinking about is, if I'm shut down, do parents continue to pay tuition? Child Care Network chose this week, when they called parents on Monday to pick their children up, to tell the parents that tuition would not be due for this week. Well, Child Care Network is a large organization, and of course that's an economic hit, but not to the extent it would be for a single school. So it's something to think about. From some of the other national providers who have not had to make this decision yet, I heard that they would possibly ask that parents pay for one of those weeks, but not the second week. And again, no decisions have been made that I'm aware of. People will make this decision as they go. I'll continue to get information from them so you guys can know what others' plans are and how to do that yourself. But what I'd like for you to do is calculate the cash impact if you didn't collect tuition for 2 weeks and you continue to pay your team. I'm not saying that's what you should do. Just want you to know what that economic impact is. That way, when the time comes, you can make the decision, I need for my parents to pay the full 2 weeks so that I can pay the team. Or I'll pay the team, I'll pay my core team who have been with me a long time in my lead team, but I can't pay everyone. Or parents will pay for 1 week, but not two. So you will be able to make decisions within that economic framework. So that's the first thing that I suggest you do. The other thing I suggest that you do is consider right now, and this was part of my general recession planning, what things can you do quickly to make a difference in your cash picture? One of those things is this may be coming up, but collect your cash more diligently than you do sometimes. If you're a person that has accounts receivable out there, be sure that you're staying on top of your payments and that you are getting those in timely. You might also delay unnecessary costs if you have a capital project coming up, like a new playground or a parking lot or painting or something that you need to do and you've preserved the cash to do. Maybe you stall a little bit. Most of the guys that I'm talking to have the opinion that we're in a short-term blip. I hope that they're right. We want to always prepare for the worst and hope for the best. But when I'm talking about unnecessary cost, hopefully that wouldn't drag out for a long period of time. We mentioned relief from the government. I mentioned that the ECEC group is already providing information to Congress about economic um, hits so that they can make decisions on how to support small business. We will keep you posted on what we hear. At this point, there are only suggestions of things that might happen. We have not seen anything concrete that we know we can count on. And then another thing, and this is kind of playing out in the last couple of days, we talked about in recession planning that recessionary times are often good growth times. So it's already been mentioned that the Small Business Administration may be having lower than normal cost loans for people who need those for operating cost or they need them for something else. So to the extent that you're in great shape to survive a liquidity event and you have an opportunity for growth, risky times are often very, very good times to consider those growths. So also balance that with your tolerance for risk. It's also risk associated with it. And the last thing that I'm going to add before Jason and I take questions, because we have a good many and I want to get to those. We've seen a lot of information, and Jason also talked about how to get your children involved. I saw a fabulous article this morning about this opportunity to be a model for children, your own children, the children that you care for, by teaching them that this is not a virus that should be harmful to them, that the real risk is that they or others might get sick, take this virus out into the community where there are other people who are more vulnerable, and we need to protect those people, teach them more about sanitation and how to keep themselves safe, and be calm. You know, just be sure that, I'm sure we all grew up in times where there was something in the community that had a panic associated with it. I think I'll never get over thinking the Russians were going to blow my house up, because that's what I heard growing up in the Cold War times. I think my mom mentioned to me the polio scare this morning. So everyone grows up in a time where they hear something at a young age that continues with them the rest of their lives. So they're watching us, and we want to be sure that we're great models for children. So let's look at where our questions are. If you guys haven't noticed yet, if you hover over the top of your screen, you will get a question bar. Please put those questions there. We have some that have come to us by email as well. So let me just pick up a couple of these. I will hit you with this one, Jason, if you don't mind. Do you think extending the sick policy to not allow any child to be in care for now who has a cold, congestion, cough, even if they don't have a fever, is something we should consider for a month or two? How far would you take that, Jason?
Well, I think one of the things is try to get those kids up for testing as quick as possible, because testing right now is really where the weakness is. But yeah, I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to expand the sick policy in this situation to say, if a kid is sick, just out of an abundance of caution. And you know, we always talk to our owners about the way you frame what you're saying is a big deal. Mm-hmm. So you want to always frame it in a way that this is, you know, we're taking these steps out of an abundance of caution for the health of everybody, including the kid who's sick, because maybe they don't have the coronavirus, but maybe they're sick with something else, and somebody else, another child, infects them, and now they're at much higher risk because now they've got kind of a double whammy. So I don't think it's unreasonable to expand your sick policy, but you're going to want to communicate that. You don't want to drop it on a parent when they pick up because the kid sneezes that, hey, you got to take Joey home because he just sneezed. You want to make sure that you're very clear and that you have very specific metrics. So in other words, if my kid sneezes once, is that the tipping point? If I cough, You know, if I have a tickle cough, is that the tipping point? Kind of where do you put the line? And that becomes really, a fever's easy because there's a number on the thermometer and you can say they have a fever. But a sniffle or a sneeze or a cough is a little bit harder to define. So you're going to want to really think through that, so that if you decide you're going to expand it, what are the actual metrics that we're using to make that determination?
Great answer. So we've got some comments over here. Are those in my question bar? Okay, in chat. So I'm just gonna, who knew you had a webinar chat? I'm not your technology person, but anyway, thank you, Sarah, for sharing this thought. I love this. Sarah's decided to proactively notify parents that they will charge them full tuition so they can pay their staff. If they're closed, so I guess that's for 14 days. If they're closed longer than 14 days, they will reevaluate this plan. If families are affected with a loss of income during the 14-day period, they would work with them to come up with a payment plan. I love the proactive nature of that. Thank you again for sharing that, Sarah. That's a fantastic idea. And if people know in advance, I think that's wonderful. Okay, so let's jump to another question. So Lee has shared a recipe with us, and I will, like I said, I will have one of my team members research and also share a sanitizer recipe. But Lee says 2/3 a cup of rubbing alcohol, 1/3 a cup aloe vera gel, also essential oil for smell. So that sounds simple, and love Jason's idea that you would get the children involved in making that. Mm. As we continue to do tours, we don't know the potential parent and their history. Is it recommended to ask if they have traveled recently? So this was mentioned by Chris Smith this morning as one of their internal questions at Child Care Network, and I will certainly ask that question on Monday when we get them online. As Chris said, because we've been declared a pandemic, there are questions you can now ask that you could not generally ask. And they are trying to come up with the 4 or 5 questions that they think should be asked before anyone tours or enrolls. So we will continue to share that information with you. Mm-hmm. If a teacher or student contracts coronavirus, should we close the class, entire school, certain period of time, or after reporting to Health and Human Services, then ask them what they recommend? I like what I described to you when we opened, that the stance that Child Care Network took, they were not required to close anything initially. So they self-reported to licensing, they self-reported to the public health department. After the investigation, they were required to have 5 teachers self-isolate, and these were the teachers that were in close proximity, and I think that Chris said within 6 feet of the teacher who tested positive. They chose to close the school for 2 days for deep cleaning. They were not mandated. And then they were told to keep that class closed for 14 days. So I think you're going to bump up against some situations where you're going to have the question internally, what do we have to do and what do we choose to do? And Jason, do you want to comment any more on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you use the guidance of your local officials, they'll really tell you. I think the minimum you'd want to do just to show that you're taking it seriously would be at least a 2-day close. And that may just be for tracking purposes, to say, okay, we want to backtrack to see who this staff, what children the staff member may have had contact with. We want to disinfect the entire school. I saw one comment in the comments that somebody had really got a guarantee from some cleaning services that they could get same-day service, which I think is great. I would say a 2-day kind of, hey, we're going to try to see what the situation is here. We're going to disinfect the school. We're going to try to track to see what children this staff member had contact with and what other staff members they had contact with at a minimum, and then take the rest of your guidance from your local health officials. If they say, I wouldn't go against what they say. In other words, if they say close, you really need to follow what their recommendation is. If they say it's up to you and you feel like you've done your due diligence in terms of tracking history of the infected person, you've cleaned the school, then I think you really have to base that decision on kind of your own judgment.
While you're, before you mute, this is a great one for you too. Can you let our guests know how to know if they're considered a high risk area? How did they get that information?
So in terms of geographically, if you're high risk, you should be able to find out from your local health department what are the number of cases in our county. That's readily available information. You can probably even get it on the local website. As far as the age range of the high risk people, it's generally over 60 and people with underlying respiratory or cardiopulmonary issues. Geographically, though, there's small pockets right now that are hotspots. Obviously, Washington State is a hotspot. So you're seeing lots of what's going to happen in Washington State is different than what's going to happen right now in Michigan. New Rochelle, New York is a hotspot. What you're going to do there is different than what you would do here. So I would really just rely on your local health department to say, hey, how many cases do we have in our area? And that's information is going to be updated regularly. A lot of the national news stations are even updating the infected on a regular basis. Like if you watch in the news, you'll see the numbers actually changing, almost just like the stock market ticker. And they're actually monitoring these cases in real time. World Health Organization actually has hotspots, so you can actually pull up a map and zoom in and see what the cases are. So there's a lot of publicly available resources if you just kind of start to bounce around the internet that will show you where the cases are. And those are tracked constantly in real time. So the minute somebody gets, a positive test, they're being entered into the CDC database, WHO, and that information is going to pop up immediately on some of the resources.
Awesome, thank you. I love this suggestion. So thank you. For the person who was a banker in a former life, has a great suggestion that if you have a line of credit, go ahead and take an advance, put that cash in a different bank account so that you have it, because the bank could freeze or stop your credit line without warning. They could also take money from that account to pay off their loans. But if you put it in a different bank, then it should be secure and available for your use. So thank you for that. So someone just shared a web-based news report, which I have not seen. It looks like an SBA link, that SBA disaster loans may be available. I will take a look at that. Thank you for sharing that, and also share that on our website as a resource. If a staff member's child's school shuts down, can that staff member come to work? Jason, want to go for that?
If a staff member's child's school shuts down, can they come to work?
Can the staff
Sure.
member come?
I don't see any reason why not. I mean, as long as they're not showing any symptoms, as long as there's no, just because their kids' school shut down doesn't necessarily mean, there's a lot of schools, even here in Michigan, that have shut down where there's no cases even. There's no cases even in the county they're in. So I think what we're seeing is just people out of an abundance of caution taking some extreme steps. So I don't see any reason why you wouldn't allow a staff person to come in as long as they're not showing any symptoms that they're sick. And obviously, taking all the precautions that you would take with any other person.
Jason, where you see public schools shutting down, are the child care centers staying open, and are the what are typically after school students then absorbed into the child care program?
Yeah, so we're just starting to see public schools shutting down. So obviously the West Coast that started, San Francisco, Seattle. We're starting to see that trickle across the country. I still don't see a lot in terms of the childcare providers shutting down yet. I think they're it's just like a weather situation. We're in Michigan where we get a lot of weather, and it's pretty common that when it snows and they cancel school for the public schools, every person is like, oh, are you guys shutting down? it's not the same thing. We're a business. We're not necessarily attached to exactly what the public schools do. So don't feel pressured if the schools close that you have to close, because parents, as long as you don't have a compelling reason, you don't have any infected and you're following your protocols, I don't see any reason why you would necessarily have to close just because the public schools close. They're on a whole different situation. They're publicly funded. They are, and it's a cost savings for them to close. Whereas for you, it can be very detrimental. And obviously the parents are counting on you for care, which is why we stay open even in the weather situations.
Yeah, one of Chris Smith at Child Care Network recommendations was to go ahead and set up a task force now, because you won't know all the questions you're going to need to deal with and answer until you know them, and you need to be ready to move quickly. So they, like I said, they literally meet every single morning to deal with that day's questions and make decisions on what to do. So at this point, you really need to be ready, knowing that you're going to have to make some decisions on the fly. And we'll certainly share whatever practices we see across the country. Does anyone recommend reducing the fever level for sending a child home? Any thoughts on that, Jason?
Yeah, I think that is kind of like the other one. I think once you start to see, I don't know what the level is now for most centers, but once you start to see a fever, I think expanding your sick policy out of an abundance of caution is going to be wise in this case, because even a low grade fever, especially in that age range, because we're actually seeing, if you look at the kids, the kids that have been infected, they show very mild symptoms, and many times if almost no symptoms at all. So even that low grade fever, they might be dangerous to them, but it might be dangerous to grandpa who comes in and pick up his kid who happens to be in the same classroom who does have an underlying condition. So I think expanding your sick policy out to say, look, for a little while, yeah, we're going to be really strict on the fever. If it's over 99 or 100, whatever you determine to be the threshold, then we're gonna enforce that sick policy.
Right. Okay, thanks. Denise has a really good comment. How does not allowing parents beyond the lobby prevent or hinder the spread of the virus since they've been with their child and the child's in your center? So it doesn't, obviously. If the parent's infected and the child's infected, then that won't prevent anything. It's really more of contrast people in classrooms, the better. Jason, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think there actually is a solid argument to be made that they're going to touch other things when they're in the facility. They're going to, so the farther they go, the more potential people they have contact with. So whereas they may have already infected their own child, that may have happened, and that child could infect maybe the people in their class. They may be passing by other classrooms. They're saying 3 hours in the air. So I'm passing the toddler classroom on the way to drop my son off, and I sneeze. And now, because I'm in the center, that's now, I've created a situation where even people not in my own child's class have the potential to be infected. Once again, I just think it's a measure that we would take that would be on the more extreme side, but it would just limit. Because if you have an infection, people are going to want to know, well, why weren't you doing this? Why weren't you, like anything else, you're going to be second guessed whether you did something or didn't do something. So my advice in these types of situations is err on the side of being more strict. That way, if something happens, nobody can say you didn't go far enough. And I think that's a wise way to handle it.
I agree with that. And I think Child Care Network's decision to close for 2 days was beautiful. They were overly cautious. You want to always take the more aggressive position. Someone is asking me that didn't get the beginning of this webinar if it is being recorded. It is. All of our webinars are recorded and on our website within 24 hours. This one will actually be up very quickly because several people have asked us. Someone is saying if you knew that you had to close 2 weeks beginning Monday, would you charge tuition for April that is about to be automatically deducted the first of every month. So these are the kind of things we're going to start to think about. And I think we have to make those up on a case by case basis. I think if it was me and someone told me today that beginning Monday you are in a mandatory shutdown, I would, of course, whether you do the debit or not depends on what your practice decision is about whether parents will continue to pay for that or not. I do really like a proactive approach and letting parents know what your intention is if you do close. I love the one that proactively said, if we have to close for 14 days, here is what we believe we will do right now. So people are prepared for that. In that case, you wouldn't need to change your draft. If you have to shut down longer than that, you might have to refund or make a different decision. So I think,
Oops,
yes.
sorry.
No,
Well,
go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that this is also a good time to revisit your handbook, because there are cases that people have these types of situation, a pandemic response, covered in their actual handbook. So it may be a time, because this may not be the last one we see, that you want to revisit your handbook to make sure that parents are signing off to one of these contingencies to say, yeah, if we have to close due to public health concerns, we'll charge tuition up to 14 days or whatever you decide to be the threshold. If you update your handbook, then going forward, you don't have to make this decision because it's already been signed off on in the actual parent handbook, and it makes it a little bit easier for you.
Good point. Someone is asking me if they can share this recording with their network of programs in their county. Please share whatever we have available. Share the recording. Once we put resources on the website, we certainly don't want to hoard information. We want to help as many people as possible, and let us know what other holes you see in information. We'll certainly try to get you what we can. Someone's asking me that they have an open house tonight and should they cancel? I have an opinion, but I'm going to let Jason go first. That's a tough one, isn't it?
If it's tonight, I probably wouldn't. Depending on where you're located physically, if you don't have any cases in your area, I would definitely be standing at the door with hand sanitizer, making sure that every single person that came in was almost like hors d'oeuvres at a cocktail party, and even walking around and spraying people. But I think this is pretty short notice to cancel something like that. So I would say you probably are okay. In this situation, if it was next week, I would probably err on the side of canceling.
Yep, that would be my opinion exactly. And I love your, that was my thought exactly. Hand sanitizer at the door. If you have some communication available for parents, the great time to hand it out. Let them know what you're doing. But anything for next week or after, I would seriously consider. Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and a question for a lot of others. Someone's taking into consideration if they choose to close, it's likely state subsidies will not pay them for tuition. So Chris Smith and I had the same conversation this morning. He does not know the answer, but Chris and his team realize that they believe that, and I believe as well, they're on the forefront of what's about to happen to a lot of providers. So in addition to going to their licensing entities, they're also discussing this with state subsidy providers who are trying to find ways, and largely subsidies are based on enrollment, and that's when providers get paid. So they are trying to see what they can do to continue payments. But I think we have to start those conversations now. And hopefully I'll have more guidance for you on that on Monday, but really good question that I think a lot of providers are going to have questions about. We're starting to see families withdraw kids to keep them away from others. The slow bleed is worse than a closure. Anyone else having that? I have not heard that. Jason, have you heard that from people?
No, I think that'll probably happen in areas where where the levels go up. I haven't heard of actually withdrawing kids. I've heard kids staying home. Um, but once again, if your policy, if your vacation policy, if they were outside of that, if they want their spot saved, for the most part, I think people have still been charging tuition. I haven't heard a lot from clients, or at least our members, clients that people are withdrawing. I haven't seen that as an issue yet.
Okay. Someone is asking if there's a home test or ways to identify the coronavirus that differentiate from a regular flu. I don't think so. Jason, speak to that.
No, and in fact, the testing, that's one of the areas where if you're watching the news, there's a lot of kind of controversy over the speed to which we're getting the testing out. It sounds like it's being ramped up to a level now where if somebody needs a test, they're going to be tested. What they don't want is people getting proactive tests. In other words, I don't have any symptoms, but I know I could be contagious if I have it, but I don't know if I have it. Should I go get tested? They're only going to test people with symptoms. So if you have symptoms of the flu, and they're first going to test you for the regular influenza, for the seasonal flu, because that's a far easier test. The results come back really quickly. And then if those results are negative, they're probably then going to test you for the coronavirus. But there's no home tests as of this point, and even the tests that are being done in medical environments, there's still, the numbers aren't there, so they're really limiting them to people that are showing the significant symptoms, and even in some cases, actually, they're only testing people that are in that high risk category. Because, like I said, if you're below 60 years old, and even if you're above 60, if you don't have underlying health conditions, the the fatality rate is extremely low. I mean, 99 point something percent of people with no existing health conditions are recovering perfectly fine. So I think you're going to see the test ramping up, which is why the numbers are going to go up. But there's no home test as of now.
Right. Okay, are you actually getting rid of these germs when you say deep clean? I haven't heard of anything. So, Jason, add to this. I would say that I'm gonna let you take it first, Jason. I think you know more technically about this than I do.
Yeah, I think if you're using the correct solutions, there's certain concentrations of alcohol, and even like soap on your hands is actually removing the germs. But if you're cleaning surfaces and you're using a specific strength of solution, it can, from my understanding is, it can eliminate it from the surfaces. The problem is you can't eliminate it from the air, and that's really what the more of the fear should be, really, than the surfaces, I think, because if it's airborne, then and it remains active for 3 hours in the air, that's really, you can't, there's nothing you can do about that. I mean, because you obviously can't see it. So
Someone is asking how they should handle families or staff traveling to Disney World. So I think this is similar to Chris Smith's comment this morning that one of their internal questions was, we have a staff member on a cruise that's due to return Monday. Do we allow her to return? They didn't have an answer for that yet. They're dealing with these things just quickly as you are, Jason.
yeah, so we have a couple school districts here. We had one put out some communication yesterday that I thought was a little bit too far, and that if you leave the state, you have to self quarantine for 14 days when you get back. Now, Michigan, we're coming up on spring break. Most people are going to leave the state, so they're asking those people to self quarantine for 14 days once they get back. I think that's maybe a little bit too much. I think you're going to have to take it on a case by case basis. Where were they? Where did they go? Was it a high risk area? If it was, they probably aren't going there. Most of the cruises that were going to high risk areas aren't going there anymore. And you know, to a certain extent, traveling to a place that is really a hotspot right now is pretty difficult. Um, so you'll have to make those decisions on a case by case basis. It may be based on how long were they there, how long have they been back. Maybe instead of putting them right back in the classroom, we have them do something else for 7 days, or we try to create kind of our own little quarantine situation where we're not necessarily having that much direct contact with the kids, maybe even especially the younger kids, um, and kind of socially engineer it in a way that limits that exposure. But I think, unfortunately, that's going to be a case-by-case basis. And as we see more community spread, which is the real concern, those situations we may see more schools saying, if you leave the state or if you go out of the country, you have to self-quarantine for a certain number of days. And I see that as a real possibility. The worst case scenario with this, they're talking about a third of the population. That's the worst, and maybe more, maybe 45% of the population being affected. I don't think it's going to get to that level, because I think we're taking these extreme measures on the front end that will help, but that's the potential.
Two of the other groups that got similar questions to parent and children travel also were trying to figure it out. But one of those that was an international group and would not allow children to return to the school if they had traveled to level 2 and 3 risk countries. They did get some criticism from parents around that. They dealt with that just by talking about the risk from those countries. There was another national group who did the same and had questions from parents who travel for their work. And largely, we're seeing just moment by moment companies shutting down travel and meetings for their teams right now. But parents asking if their children couldn't come back if the parent was the one that traveled. And they even limited that because from certain countries, if the parent came back into the home and was with the child, they didn't want that child back in the school for 2 weeks. So agree with Jason that you have to really look at that on a case-by-case basis. And we'll try to share guidelines that others are using so you can come up with your own guidelines, which might have to be fluid and change as the situation changes. We have someone asking if they had to lay off employees, could they apply for unemployment? It's been so long since we've had an unemployment question because there's so much employment the last couple of years. If the rules have not changed, employees have to be out of work 2 weeks before they qualify for unemployment. But once they're out of work 2 weeks, I believe they can apply for unemployment. But I would certainly investigate that to the extent that you need employees not to work for longer than 2 weeks. We have someone asking about caring for school-age children when schools have been shut down. This is a question other providers are asking. At the moment, it appears that most of those believe that they would be a solution for working parents, for the children to come to their schools. The challenges would be gearing up for that quickly and the amount of staff that they would need to care for the school-age children when that happens quickly. And so they're thinking through that. But at the moment, the providers that have school-age programs are thinking that they would be a solution for parents whose children are in schools that get shut down. And then, like we've talked about here, some childcare programs may choose to close as well along with the schools. What do you think, Jason?
Yeah, and I was going to say, you may base your decision on whether to take the school-age children on the reason that the school shut down. If the school shut down because they had people that were infected, that's a whole different reason than the schools that are just proactively shutting down. I think you're perfectly safe taking in a district just says, we're just going to shut down out of an abundance of caution because we can. I don't think you're at any increased risk by taking in the school age kids. If you have a district that shuts down because we've had 15 cases, 15 is probably more like 150 because they're like I said, it's an order of magnitude. Then you may want to reconsider and say, you know what, we're just not willing to take that chance of having these kids come in from this district that had this infection. I think you have to really base it on why the school was shut down in the first place.
Good thought. Let's take maybe 2 or 3 more questions. We have so many that we will get back with you guys on all of your questions. We certainly will take them all very seriously and try to post information and keep you guys informed about what others are doing. Jason, do you know how long germs live on surfaces?
I don't know the exact time frame. I know, and I don't think they even have that. The 3 hours in the air is something that was just a new piece of information that I heard. I would assume the worst case scenario, 6 to 12 hours. So you know, it's going to live longer on a surface than it is in an airborne environment, because if it's not disturbed by anything, there's nothing to. So I think it's a much longer time it's going to be active.
Okay. We have a question about strategies if you have to close longer than 2 weeks. I'm going to dig those up for you guys. Of course, my content I presented at Shift related to an economic downturn, not a full-blown shutdown, which I think would surprise me. But like we said, we want to always over-prepare. I think you would see broad economic relief if that was the case. But I'm going to give some thought to strategies for that between now and Monday. Thank you for that question. And let's see, several people are saying they're seeing families withdraw for 2 weeks, so they're actually seeing that happen. One more question, fingerprint entry systems. Unlocking the doors isn't an option, of course, but sanitizing between each person seems impossible. So, Jason, can you give us some thoughts on how you would handle that?
Yeah, so if you can sanitize before the fingerprint and then sanitize after, or one or the other, is what you're going to have to do. Both would be the best case scenario. So I use my fingerprint and then my hand is sanitized after that. So theoretically, if I had the virus on my hands and I just now washed my hands or sanitized my hands, I should have killed that, right? Now it's still going to be on for the next person, but if we are consistent about that process, I'm a security guy, so I'm never a fan of leaving the door unlocked. Our primary goal at SEC is safety and security. So I think you want to keep your access control in place and just use and that's another reason why, you know, if you can avoid people coming, the less people you get coming in, if you can do more of a pickup drop off situation, you may be able to limit that potential exposure as well. And one of the things, Kathy, is I'm happy to have, and I didn't see it, I don't know if it was on here before, but to share my email address with anybody who's been on here. And they can also email me questions directly, and I'm happy to take any of those.
Yeah, so thank you so much for your information. Please tell our guest how they can get in touch with you.
Yeah, so you can email me. Our website is secured.com. That's SECURE ed, ED, so there's 2 E's there, .com. And my email address is Jason, JASON, .Russell, RUSSELL, at secured.com. So jason.russell at secured.com. And if you're an SEC client, you have access to our membership site where all of this information, including sample letters and stuff, will be. So if you're already a member, you can just go to our Secure Ed site. If you're not, just email me if you have a question. I'm happy to help out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time that you put into helping develop this content and to answering people's questions. I've already warned Jason that I'm sure I'll be bugging him again over the next coming weeks to help us develop strategy as we go. So thanks in advance for that, Jason. We will get a new link out to anyone interested in Monday's masterclass with the team at Child Care Network and an update on how they're handling their recent issue in Atlanta and what they've learned and what they suggest to you guys. So we will look forward to that. Please send us other questions, other information that will be useful to you guys, and we will make a commitment to trying to be as strong a resource as possible as you navigate this time in our world that I never thought I would see in my lifetime, and I imagine most people didn't. So thank you again for joining. Thanks, Jason, and have a good weekend, everyone.